Hello, my name is Ottmar Edenhofer. I'm the director of the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research in Germany. At the same time, I'm professor for the economics of climate change. And today, I'm very happy that we have a great seminar on climate policy in times of war. And I'm very pleased that we have three important and great panelists. And let me start with Veronika Grimm. Veronika Grimm is professor of economic theory at the Friedrich Alexander University in Nuremberg, Erlangen, in Germany. She studied economics and sociology at several universities, and she is now the member of the German advisory committee on economics, what we call in German the Wirtschaftsweisen. So Veronika Grimm will speak today about the political reactions within the EU and Germany on the current crisis. And Veronika Grimm is very much involved in the public debate on this issue. So our second panelist is Georg Zachmann. So he's a senior fellow at the Brussels-based think tank Bruegel, and he's an expert on climate and energy policy, and he has published very important papers on the current Ukraine crisis. And today he will talk about the market situation on the gas and on the oil market and appropriate response actions to the war in the Ukraine. And the third panelist is Philippe Martin. He's professor of economics at the Department of Economics at Sciences Po. And he is chair and he's an expert on macroeconomic policy. And he will talk today about the macroeconomic risks like inflation and also the impact, the macro impact of the current energy crisis in Europe. Every panelist has 15 minutes for the statement, and then I will try to facilitate a debate among the panelists. And if there is an agreement, I would like to make sure that we understand the agreement among the panelists. If there's a disagreement, so I see my main role to make the disagreements explicit. So after 45 minutes or a little bit later, so then I will open the debate to questions, to the Q&A, and we will end our webinar punctually after 90 minutes. So first, I would like to invite Georg Zachmann to inform us about the current status on the gas and on the oil market, and in particular, on issues like the price cap for oil and gas, the embargo, and in particular, so to say, what he calls a grand bargain to steer Europe through the current energy crisis. So, Georg, hand over to you, 15 minutes, and I hope you can explain us everything what we have to know to understand the current crisis.
Yes, thanks a lot, Ottmar. Exciting times, and I would like to essentially have two pitches and would try to rush a bit through, hoping that that we are then getting some questions to put up a discussion. So let me start first with some sorts on the on essentially the war type element. So kind of the sanctions, counter sanctions with Russia and what we are experiencing right now, because I think it's also for the long-term decarbonization agenda quite relevant. Now, quickly going through the three main views and kind of pointing a bit to where we stand and what is still ahead. Now, oil, Russia is a major oil exporter. If you see the numbers, they have been exporting around 8 million barrels per day, which is about 8% of global production. So it is very substantial. More than a third of that went to the EU. More than half of that essentially to the West, or a pro-Ukrainian coalition, as one might call it now. And both crude oil and oil products are important. And diesel, for example, is a challenge at the moment to be replaced in Europe. Now, what did Western sanctions essentially do? Well, the UK and the US relatively quickly started to sanction Russian oil imports, which was less of a problem for them because they went elsewhere. The EU sanctions will only kick in December for crude, if I'm not mistaken, and for products in February next year. And most importantly, the sanctions that the EU has currently agreed are going to undermine also exports to non-EU countries and non-Western countries. So the idea is that insuring and shipping of this oil will be sanctioned, which might in the end slash a significant amount of Russian oil exports out of the market. Now, we have started to track a bit Russian oil exports to see how they reacted. So you can see the corresponding track on our website. What we don't track is pipeline exports. So therefore, I flagged that here. So there is the exports to China will still continue to go on. There is a pipeline to China, and there is a port in the Pacific, which probably will not be affected by Western sanctions. There is the pipeline system that I showed you on the map before. The Druzhba pipeline to Europe, which is not insignificant. And currently, oil seems to be still flowing until June. But in August, we already saw that the Russians stopped transiting essentially oil through the southern arm, which we might not, which Russia claims has to do with the inability to pay for the Ukrainian transit. So a clear strategy that we also see in the gas, that they link our sanctions to the inability to deliver fuels to us. Now, what we observe in the first months of this year is essentially the imports to the EU have been slightly gone down. So the thick red line that you can see on the graph, while the imports of Russian oil by mainly India, China, have essentially surpassed by now the imports that the EU has been taking from there. So we see rerouting is already happening. And if we look into the European Union statistics, what we also observe is that most countries have not changed behavior much. A part of the Baltic countries that got a bit less, and Hungary that got a bit more. So there is also some reshuffling inside the EU, but nothing dramatic to that date. Now, the big question that I think we should discuss, and that is being discussed politically, and for which we need a good plan, is whether we are going for the full embargo that is planned by the end of the year on a European level, or whether we find a smarter tool that has better cost-benefit ratio for the EU. So the current plan is essentially a cliff edge that, if implemented very effectively in terms of sanctioning shipping, might slash some 3 to 5 million barrels per day off the market. So that's 3 to 5% of global oil supplies. And in normal times, that would be very drastic. And the current times are already showing a very tight market conditions. And it has the potential to upset other trading partners if you essentially implement secondary sanctions on them. So the G7 is pretty nervous about the macro consequences and the political consequences. And what they came up with is this idea of a price cap, which has as an idea to allow exports to India and China and other non-pro-Ukrainian countries if the Russians sell at a price that is below this cap, which is going to be administrative nightmare. And I think we are essentially pushing the Russians into the arms of the others by telling them, okay, do all sorts of kickbacks with the Indians and Chinese to get your oil. So I'm relatively skeptical that this is a good idea. The other option that is being discussed is still an idea of putting a tariff on oil that is imported by the EU. And I think that would have a much better cost-benefit ratio, as kind of we would still not harm ourselves, and we would manage to reduce the income of Russia in the same way as we could do with the price cap. The second element is natural gas exports. Here, even more strikingly, Europe was the biggest market in volume and even more in value. To China, there's only a small pipeline, and Turkey started to import a bit more since last year and continues to do so. And what we have seen this year is essentially that, already last year, that since summer last year, I don't know whether you can see my mouse pointer, the Russians started to reduce quite significantly the gas exports to the European Union, and that trend has continued into 2022 towards a situation where we are getting a quarter, a fifth of what we usually got from the Russians, resulting in very high prices. Now the Russians essentially linked that to our sanctions. They were saying, okay, we cannot pay them in, or they cannot use the dollars and euros we pay them anymore, so we should pay them in rubles. That was the first blip in spring, and then they had this technology things with Nord Stream. So they clearly use the gas as a tool to try to push back on our sanctions. And here I have a very provocative question, and my provocative question is, do we potentially want to find a robust arrangement to trade gas with Russia in the future? So is our policy that says by 2027 we are not going to import gas from Russia anymore, is that credible? Or is there the risk that we go back in 1 or 2 years' time to a world where Russia starts to selectively supply individual European companies in individual countries, or decides to flood the market in order to kill all the projects that have now been started at very high gas prices, as they used after the shale gas revolution in the US? So I am wondering whether we should not invest some time also in terms of thinking on what could be a robust arrangement for the European side to get very good terms of trade in this, to not help the Russians finance their war efforts, but at the same time that kind of is credible enough for not being susceptible to essentially being flooded with cheap Russian gas at a certain moment in the next decade. That would probably be quite damaging for a lot of the investment projects that are currently going on. And maybe the safeguarding could also help the investment projects today to better take off. Then on coal exports, there is the only real sanctions that the Europeans have actually put in place, maybe on top of electricity, where the countries that imported electricity from Russia themselves stopped. So here, since August, we are not buying anymore, but the effect of that has essentially been a global reshuffling of coal trade in the globally. So that I'm not sure whether Europe is much harmed, and I'm not sure whether Russia is much harmed. It's largely reshuffling. But yeah, our data on that are relatively modest, so I'm not pushing too hard. So on this, the way ahead, I mean, we see here that the Russian revenues from oil, gas, and coal selling have not gone down, despite all our efforts on discussing sanctions, at least. Yeah, my take would be it would be good to discuss tariff on oil imports, managing gas imports potentially with a cap or something, and new diversification tools. So I wonder whether Europe as a whole, now in the thinking also about the new energy world, can find ways to not get into this one-sided dependencies that we got with Russia in the past, because that was clearly unsustainable. Now, I would quickly jump presentations to another one on the paper, and I hope I'm not too fast at the moment. So that should be it. So this is a paper we released essentially, I think, last week, and the idea of this paper is to say the current energy crisis is not only one about very high prices at the moment, which is most of the political attention on, but it's a crisis that goes very deep to the roots of the European energy system, but also potentially to deeper kind of undermining trust between member states and being politically extremely divisive potentially in the coming weeks and months. And I mean, we are seeing signs of that. What we argue is that the current crisis that we see is not entirely due to the Russia shock. The Russia shock is only one of three things that we are experiencing, and I think it's very important to make that point. We have seen significant underinvestment in the past decade compared to the demand that we currently experience. The question is what went wrong and what can we learn from that? Then there is the Russia shock, and then there is this, we call it here unfortunate coincidences of French nuclear power plants being offline at the lowest level in many, many years, and the droughts that reduced hydropower production quite substantially. So we are having kind of a perfect storm, and the results of that are drastic. So the risks that we are seeing, on the one hand, political, so being played by Russia, what I explained before. But what I am very much afraid of is that that we will get into a system where member states will try to pull the tissue of limited energy supplies towards them by subsidizing energy domestically. And we see that happening quite strongly in different member states and in different forms. The problem is the amount of energy that we can get into Europe with higher prices is almost inelastic by now. That means every euro that one country spends to allow its consumers to buy more energy means that another country has less energy available in the European Union. And we are essentially in a subsidy battle for the last remaining kilowatt hours that are available on the market, and that's pushing up prices. And I think in this situation, we very clearly need some sort of moratorium on supporting energy consumption in Europe. And that's politically extremely difficult because, I mean, we're all speaking to different ministries, and the first reaction is, yeah, please help our energy consumers to be able to consume the same amount of energy they used to consume, while we all know that that demand reduction that we potentially need to get over next winter is something in the order of 15% or so for natural gas and a bit less for electricity. So my main worry is that countries like Germany with deep pockets might be able to put a lot of money on the table to buy energy from markets, meaning that other countries in the European Union are not able to do so, but other countries having the possibility to essentially close borders and thereby to kind of keep energy domestically. We see that to a certain degree in Spain, that seemingly has reduced a bit the exports of electricity to France. We see discussions in Norway, and I mean they will also pop up in other countries. So we need to find a way to avoid that. And the discussions that we are seeing now on price caps are, in my view, going in the wrong direction here, because I don't think we have a problem of prices being dramatically uncoupled from reality, but we have a problem of having too little energy available. And one side point that I would like to highlight, and I would love to have an hour-long discussion with you about that, is the question of the kind of ecosystem of European energy company and the energy finance nexus in Europe, because that's something I do not fully understand. But I understand that we now have liquidity problems in the first European countries where energy companies are getting hundreds of billions of euros in liquidity support to sustain the higher prices, and at the same time, companies being bailed out or renationalized. And I wonder whether there is a risk of kind of piecemeal national solutions, no joint supervision of what is happening, that this thing spirals out of control. Because my understanding is that all these energy companies are highly interrelated with each other and with the financial sector, because there's a lot of lending, and the volumes we are talking about in the electricity trade is, I think, just the sales volume of the electricity is something like 10% of GDP. So it's not trivial anymore. Now, what are we suggesting? What we are suggesting is essentially we would like to try to solve the problem on a fundamental side, so with demand and supply measures. On the demand side, the hope would be to really find tools to encourage individual consumers to reduce consumption with either compensation tools or campaigns or mandates or regulations. Also unlock politically difficult demand reduction, like regulatory measures, so saying, okay, you are allowed now to reduce the temperature in housing by a certain degree. And on the supply side, to see what we all have still available. I think there is still fuel switching potential quite significantly available that for some environmental reasons is not yet allowed. We still have the nuclear plants. I think there's going to be a discussion about that also. The coal-fired power plants. But also in terms of renewables, I'm not entirely sure whether we need all these rules that are constraining, for example, solar panels to be only fixed on rooftops, which is going to be very, very difficult. I mean, we need those solar panels to be deployed very quickly. So why, if we only need it for the next decade, can we not put it on fields? I mean, this is easily to be removed later on. I think if we talk about a wartime economy, maybe things that have been unthinkable in a situation of prices of 15 euro per megawatt hour for gas are showing different trade-offs at 150 or 300 euro per megawatt hour. And to keep the whole thing together, our take would be everybody brings something to the table. Problem being that the spillovers are the strong positive spillovers from the demand and supply side actions of what member states are doing. So every member state has no incentive necessarily for its own to do too much on this, because it will just reduce the European price. So we need some sort of grand bargain, and potentially to make this bargain happen, we could also think about some sort of energy security fund, some utilization to help some countries that bring more to the table to be compensated for this. If you think, for example, for Dutch gas production, I understand very well that the Dutch government, the Dutch population is not super eager to go there, but the benefit that Europe would take from that would be enormous. And yeah, with that, I think Ottmar unmuted, and I think it's a good time to stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Georg. That's great. I think we should now go through all the presentation, and then we can facilitate the debate. And I think the design of your grand bargain is very interesting. So we will discuss at a later stage what is the likelihood that such a grand bargain can be implemented in a credible way. So for the time being, Georg, thank you very much. I would now like to hand over to Veronika on her view on the political reactions and the policy measures within the EU and in Germany. Veronika.
I think Georg and we are very complementary in what we will talk about. So my focus is first also on the energy prices in Europe. And this concerns the gas prices. Georg talked a lot about the gas prices, but this concerns also the electricity prices that are increasing now by quite a bit in recent weeks. And at the same time, we have still a lot of pressure on global supply chains. And I think it's worthwhile to briefly look at the intermediate term in order to just get a good picture of what this crisis is about and how we have to think about immediate measures to deal with the prices and the energy crisis, how we have to think about the longer term in order not to damage too much the conditions to get out of this situation again. So what in Europe, high energy prices and inflation, we have supply chain pressure, raw material shortages, and also shortages of skilled work. And we are in a situation where we need a lot of investment. And here you see some calculations that we have done on the future electricity system. So pre-war, the expectation, especially for Germany, was that we will substitute our coal and our nuclear power plants by investing in gas power plants in order to switch to an energy system that relies on renewables on the one hand, but of course, in order to deal with the fluctuation of renewables, there was a need to invest in gas power plants that in the long run can be run by hydrogen as soon as this is available, but this is in the further future. So at the same time, we see that until 2030, of course, renewables will ramp up a lot. We would have seen investment in a lot of gas power plants. This is, of course, uncertain right now, because who invests in these plants that are needed to substitute coal and nuclear in the medium term? Electricity consumption will increase. So the government anticipates that it will increase by 30% due to electrification, heat pumps, electric mobility, and so on. So we will have more electricity consumptions. We have these gas plants that are needed. We need to think already now about building up a network for hydrogen, which will take quite some time. And these are all decisions that are needed right now that cannot be postponed very much, because we need somehow a way out of this crisis in a time where, of course, all these ramp-ups and all these investment decisions will be challenged by shortages of material and skilled work. What will happen to our electricity system in the short run? Now, in the short run, we have to avoid gas consumption. Georg emphasized it, and I think this is very true. We are not yet in a situation where we have downscaled gas consumption enough in order to get safely through the winter. I mean, we can get there, but we are not yet there. So we have to substitute gas also in the electricity sector by coal power plants in the short run. And there is a big discussion in Germany about whether to extend the lifetime of the 3 existing nuclear power plants by either a few months or even a few years. I think the government has decided to do a few months, but not yet has decided to extend the lifetime by a few years, which might be reasonable if you see that there's a lot of need for coal electricity production in the next years if you don't invest enough in gas power plants, or if we have to still limit the consumption of gas in the power sector. So this is a situation, and I think this is a situation that is very challenging in the European market, and also the price pressure that we see at the moment, of course, is due to the high gas prices that increase the prices that are bid by gas power plants into the electricity market, but it's also caused by the low availability of the nuclear power plants in France, which also extends the pressure at the electricity market. So in the longer run, how much coal electricity production we will see in Germany will depend very much on the gas price, because whether coal power plants will run or will not run in the German electricity mix in the upcoming years will depend on whether gas power plants are before or after the coal power plants in the merit order. And this depends on the gas price. If the gas price is very high, the coal power production will be called first. And if the gas price becomes lower, then of course the gas power production will dominate coal, but only if, of course, enough gas is available. And as we just heard, this will take quite some time until gas is available, so that we can really count on this solution. So there are a lot of things that we could talk about. So the question is not only how long will the coal power plants stay in the German electricity mix, but the question is also how much will they produce, just due to the just due to what happens on the electricity market, which of course depends on the relative prices of coal and gas power production. And this will have all kinds of impacts. For example, if the gas price becomes or stays quite high, then there will even be an incentive to stop or to reduce to keep more coal power plants in the market, also in neighboring countries like, for example, Poland. So this might actually be something that puts the CO2 emission trading system very much under pressure if there's a lot of coal power production in Germany and in Poland and in neighboring countries. So what is urgent immediately, I think, is that we have to activate really all the available capacity for electricity production at the moment in order to get the prices down again. So we think a lot of intervening in the electricity market design. There's a lot of debate on this in Germany as well as in Europe. But of course, instead of or before you think extensively about intervening in the market design, I think it's the first task to really make all the capacity, the production capacity of existing power plants available. There are a lot of power plants that are currently in the reserve in Germany. It's coal power plants for sure. There are some nuclear power plants which are which should be switched off, should have been switched off at the end of this year, but now they are extended. Two of them are extended for some months in order to get us safer through the winter. But of course, one could also think about extending them for 3 or 4 years so that we shift the merit order to the right, so that the price just gets lower because of more supply of electricity, more cheaper supply of electricity being available at the electricity market. I think at the same time we have, when we do this, we have to think about overcoming this situation by building gas power plants and by making, in the longer run, hydrogen available to fuel the gas power plants with renewable energy. So basically, if we don't decide on this in very short time, the longer we wait, basically, the longer this crisis will go on, because we have no good alternatives to overcome the intermediate power production by coal and by nuclear. And I think this is especially challenging because the coal power production will increase CO2 prices in the European emission trading system. And the question then is, how the political discussion will go on if the emission prices, on top of all the high prices that we observe already right now, will increase beyond what was expected beforehand. This situation, of course, is very challenging also for the people in all European member states. In Germany, the MCC, Ottmar and colleagues have done a very nice study where they quantified what are what is the financial burden that comes for first gas households that are heating with gas in Germany, and for households, on the other hand, that are not heating with gas but otherwise. And you see here, so red is, sorry. On the right-hand side, you see in every picture in both sides, the households that do not heat with gas. And on the left-hand side, red and green, you see the burden for households that heat with gas. So what you see is that in Germany, due to the high price hikes of gas, the households heating with gas experience a particularly high burden. They don't experience it yet because not all the prices have been passed through to the people, but in any case, they will have 4 or 5 times as high tariffs to pay for their gas consumption. And of course, households up to medium intermediate incomes will not be able to bear that. And I think this is a very big challenge that has not been addressed yet, that these households have to be, there has to be some support, some particular support for these households so that they have the feeling that they can come to through the crisis and pay their bills. What has been decided already in Germany is a relief package. So there was a first and a second relief package. Now there was a third relief package. It is an amount of what was announced, 65 billion euro, and there are support. There's support for transfer recipients, for pensioners, and for students. There is an intention to extract random profits at the electricity markets to finance basically a price cap on electricity for basic demand for every household, but it is still unclear how this exactly should work. And I think it depends very much how deeply you intervene into the market design, how much you can really extract on these markets. Then there is very curiously, there is a suspension of an increased step of the CO2 price in the mobility and the heat sector. It should have been increased by €5 in 2023, but this is suspended for the moment, which is somehow a bad signal for climate protection. So I think the relief that households will have by this is minimal, but the signal that climate protection is at stake is big in a way. So this is not understandable why this exactly happened. The biggest surprise in this relief package is actually that particular support for gas customers is missing. And this was really surprising because they will experience or already experience quite a big burden. I have talked to many people who paid €100 per month up to now, and now it increased to €800 per month. And this is something that, of course, a household with a normal income can hardly bear for quite some time. So I think what is particularly frightening is the intention to intervene in the electricity market design, and there are a manifold of proposals. I think you can order them somehow. So one kind of proposal says that there should be a price cap for gas that is used in the electricity production. So making the marginal technology cheaper, basically. That is one intervention that is proposed. That would, and the hope is that this decreases prices immediately without any further intervention. I'm not sure whether this is a clever way to go. The second types of proposal is to propose that there should be different markets for technologies with high and low marginal costs to separate, so to say, the market for gas, electricity production by gas power plants, and by the rest, which is also difficult to imagine how this could work out. There are proposals to tax windfall profits, and there are so-called windfall profits. Also depends how you determine them, and there are proposals to put a price cap on electricity. And I think this is a very difficult discussion, and I think we have to be very careful that there is no permanent damage done to the electricity market. many of these proposals might really worsen the situation in the medium term. Price caps, for example, increase the incentives to consume electricity, or if you do it with gas, they increase the incentive to consume gas. And this is, of course, something that is very counterproductive at the moment. The separation of markets for different technologies will be very difficult, as well as any other intervention into these markets, because firms typically trade beyond the power exchange. So there are long-term and immediate contracts at the power exchange and beyond the power exchange. And there are also long-term contracts existing. So, and energy imports and exports. And it's very difficult to imagine how exactly you can intervene into these markets so that it really works out and market participants don't avoid the intervention by just trading, otherwise inventing new tariffs. I think this is very dangerous to do it, because in the end you will end up not extracting the profits, but damaging the markets a lot. So if measures have to be taken, then I think it is worth to think about proposals that aim at taxing the revenue from inframarginal electricity production whenever gas-fired power plants are the marginal production technology. This could maybe lead to some revenue extraction, but I doubt that this will lead to a lot of revenues. And if you look at the German relief package, then you see that for a huge part of the package, it's not clear how it should be financed. So this suggests that politicians hope that a huge part of it is financed by the intervention in the electricity markets. And I would doubt that this will be possible in the end, and it will take quite some time. So the relief package says that this should be discussed at the European level, and only if the discussion at the European level is not successful, then it should be implemented at the national level. So I think we will also see a lot of discussions on this, but not a lot of real action.
Veronica,
so
very close. Yeah, okay. So
that's my last slide.
Okay.
Basically, what are reasonable measures that could be taken? I think first we have to decrease demand for electricity and gas through price signals, and simultaneously support low and medium income groups in order to be able to bear that. This has two advantages. They are in the position so uncertainty is reduced, and also electricity and energy consumption is reduced. We have to massively and fast increase the electricity supply. So this is something that has to be focused on. This is not done consequently enough. One could have some measures to extract inframarginal profits, but it's not clear whether this works out as far as one as politics finds it desirable. And one should procure gas among EU member states jointly. And it is, in my view, attractive to combine it with contracts on hydrogen and derivatives of hydrogen, and maybe discussions, negotiations on critical raw materials. And my last slide illustrates a little bit what this could be about. I think it is very difficult to procure gas with short-term contracts at the moment. But maybe it is possible if you combine negotiations on the long-term procurement of renewable energy sources, then maybe there are attractive deals to be made worldwide, maybe also with democratic countries, but not only. Okay, thank you very much.
Veronica, thanks. Great for this excellent presentation. Now, before we start with the discussion, I would like now to invite Philipp to talk about the macroeconomic risks of this crisis. Philippe, please.
Okay, thank you, Otmar. Hi to everybody. So indeed, I'm going to talk a little bit about the macro dimension of this issue, although Giorgio already mentioned some of the issues I want to talk about. So I'll talk about the impact of war on inflation, but pretty quickly, because in a sense, I think we know quite a lot on this. Then I'll talk about the policy measures, debates, and questions. And here, I would stress that there are many things we don't know, and that it's difficult from that point of view to give robust policy recommendations. In a sense, I think we should not forget that we are in truly exceptional circumstances, and that the policy instincts that we have as economists, which are fine in normal circumstances, we should be ready to question them in face of these exceptional circumstances, and in face also of some of the uncertainties that we have on some empirical estimates. So there are many things we don't know very well, and I'll come back to this. And then I've been asked to say just a word on nuclear energy in France. I'm not super competent, so I'll be a bit short on that, and I'll be very happy to hear more from you. So on the impact of war on inflation, yes, the role of war on inflation was very important, but as already said, inflation started to increase. In fact, before the war in Ukraine, we were already around 5% by the end of the year. Maybe part of the increase of the of energy prices, in particular of gas, and that was already quite high during the fall, was linked to the preparation of the war by the Russians. But it was already high, and it was the fact that we had, of course, a big increase in demand due to the exit of COVID, to problems of global supply chains, etc. And then we have, of course, the acceleration after the war. Today, basically, we are at around 9% in the Eurozone, and the ECB tells us that mechanically, out of this 9%, 4% is coming directly from energy. But of course, there's contagion of the increase in energy prices through the supply chains towards other sectors. So it's a bit more than actually 4%. So clearly, the inflation problem is mainly at this stage still in Europe an energy problem. We see some contagion. This is the case. I've looked at France in particular, some contagion across other sectors, industry for, in some sense, mechanical reasons, but also in services. For the moment, though, we don't see much of a wage price contagion, and from that point of view, if you look at real wages in Europe, in the Eurozone, they have been falling. So sadly, they will react, but with delay. But at this point, it doesn't seem that wages are increasing that much. By the way, and as a macroeconomist, we should be always modest. I think we should acknowledge that as macroeconomists, we don't understand super well the dynamics of inflation. That's obviously a problem. Typically, the way we explain inflation dynamics to our students through the Neo-Keynesian Phillips curve is that there are three components, and the three of them are important in the present story. Of course, the one that we have in mind, I already talked about, is the cost push shock for inflation, and that's the big part here. The second one typically is about what's happening on the labor market and through wages, and here the fact that we have in some sense the word perfect storm was already mentioned. That's exactly this. We had both on the supply and the demand side bad news for inflation. So it's true that we had some excess demand. However, as I said, the impact on wages have not been very large for the moment. There will be some delayed impact maybe, but for the moment, there's no wage price circle. And it's true that clearly the supply, I mean, the energy shock is clearly has an impact as a cost push shock, but it's also a negative demand shock for households. We've heard some of what Veronica was telling us about the impact on households' income. Clearly, it's a negative demand shock from that point of view, and we've seen that consumption is falling in many parts of the Eurozone, because simply real income is falling. So from that point of view, on the second part of the Phillips curve, on in some sense the demand side, the demand dependent part of the inflation, we already have something that should at some point have decreasing impact on inflation. And then there's the third factor in the new Keynesian inflation curve, which is expectations. And here it's a bit difficult. I mean, for the moment, we don't have as many measures as in the US on expectations. We don't have a lot of information to what extent the inflation expectations have been de-anchored, which is clearly the big danger for the Eurozone and the big concern, of course, for the ECB. It's true that the way we think about expectations, certainly the fact that energy and is very visible, certainly has an impact on inflation expectations. If we think of models of inflation expectations which are not maybe fully rational, but where the issue of the intensity of media attention, etc., is important. So, but for the moment, as I said, in some sense, we don't know much, and clearly the actions of the ECB, because that's their mandate. Their mandate is 2% inflation. Is that even though the ECB actions of increasing the interest rate won't have a direct impact on oil prices, gas prices, etc., they are very concerned about inflation expectations being de-anchored. I should say also that on the policy side, a big part of the energy shock at different degrees in different European countries have been absorbed, in fact, by fiscal policy, more or less, and I think it's Bruegel who has looked at that, but others have looked at this too, is that, and of course it's different across Eurozone countries, the shock or the transfer of purchasing power to the rest of the world, and partly to the Russians, is around 3 percentage points of GDP. And more or less, again, depending on countries, it's different, but more or less, out of these 3 percentage points, 2 percentage points have been absorbed by fiscal policy. At least this is the case, for example, in France. So it's a big part. So 2 percentage points for fiscal policy, which is basically financed by debt, and 1 percentage point by households. For the moment, the firms, and again that may change, have been hit, but extremely heterogeneously. We have some firms which are making huge profits, and some firms that are hit very badly in the manufacturing sector. So as you know, on these fiscal measures, there are two types of measures. Either you, and Veronica clearly alluded to the fact that this is the type of measures she would prefer, targeted transfers to households which are the most modest or the more energy dependent. I'm all for it, but I'm going to maybe differ a bit with Veronica on this, because this is not so easy to put in place. If it was only an issue of income, we know how to do this. We know, the taxed income, so we can do a transfer. In France, in 2 weeks, you can send a check to people below a certain level of income. But the problem is that the heterogeneity is not only in terms of income. The problem is that the heterogeneity depends very much where you are located and what is your equipment in terms of how you heat yourself, whether you have 1 car, 2 cars, etc. So I'm all for more targeting, and in particular in France. France has gone all the way towards the other type of measure I'm going to talk, and so I'm very favorable to have more targeting. But let's not fool ourselves. I don't think it's going to be that easy to fully have a complete price signal and fully target total target towards the most modest and the most energy dependent. So the second type of measures that have been taken are price caps, rebates, etc. And in France, in particular, this has been pretty strong. So we all know that economists prefer 1 to 2. That's obvious, and we know the reasons. The number one is costly from a fiscal, number two, the price caps, the rebates are very costly from a fiscal point of view. Although, as one has to bear in mind that, in France, when we do these rebates, it has a direct impact on the inflation rate. And that's one reason France has a lower inflation rate than the Eurozone. We are around 6% when the Eurozone is at 9%. So these policy measures have a macroeconomic impact. And when we have a 6% inflation rate rather than 9%, that means that quite a lot of the social benefits which are indexed to inflation are actually not increased. So in some sense, we're spending less because of, in terms of social benefits, etc., because of these non-targeted price caps. Now, the price caps we know have also problems in terms of inefficiency. Clearly, from a micro point of view, they are inefficient because they send the wrong price signal. But here, let's be modest. Do we know what is the size of the inefficiency cost of this? I'm not completely sure. I mean, I've tried to look, and maybe some of you will have better answers than me, but what are the estimates when we have such a huge increase of prices of the price elasticity for households? I mean, we don't have any estimate. So I've tried to look. I mean, yes, maybe if there's a 10% increase in prices, we would be able to say this is what's going to happen to a gas consumption of households. But to be honest, I don't think we know. I mean, I've looked at elasticities, and in the short term, they would be around pretty small, around maybe 0.1. But when you have a huge increase in prices, are we sure that these elasticities are linear? They stay constant? I don't know. And so the empirical evidence, I think, is pretty scarce, and I think we have a problem in terms of policy recommendation, because when we criticize price caps, we understand that one of the problems is the fact that we have excess demand, and we'll have to deal with this excess demand. Except that if, as George was saying, the supply curve is vertical and the demand curve is almost vertical too, because in the short term the price elasticity is low, maybe the excess demand is not that big. So we need to address these issues, and I don't think it's very credible to say we're going to have the price signal in such a way that it will generate a 15% decrease in gas consumption by households. I mean, if we believe 0.1, and I don't know, maybe it's too low, maybe even too high, that would mean a 150% increase in prices of gas for households. Do we think that socially, politically, it's something feasible? I mean, so at some point, I think we reached the limit of our economics exercise in terms of saying we should have zero price caps, no rebates, no general issue. We know they're bad, and I fully agree with that. But at some point, I think we reach the limit of this exercise. And the third thing I want to say about this price cap: so yes, they have a fiscal cost. Yes, they have a micro or inefficiency cost in terms of the elasticity. And I'm going to be here a bit heterodox, but they have a macro gain in the sense of reducing the inflation rate. Again, the inflation rate in France is around 6%, in a sense that there's an externality for the rest of the Eurozone, macro externality, a positive and a negative. The positive one is that, in a sense, and I've heard that from pretty high level at the ECB, is that in some sense we're making the life of ECB a bit easier by spending all this money on these price caps on reducing inflation. It has a negative externality too, because France is actually gaining some competitiveness and buying it with fiscal policy, which is not supposed to be. We are not supposed to use the fiscal instrument to reduce inflation and increase competitiveness for France. So at some point, maybe the Commission is going to say this is not exactly what you should do. Let me finish on nuclear. You know the situation. 32 out of the 56 reactors are closed now. If we believe EDF, the French producers, 28 should be reactivated by December and the rest by February. Now we've been accustomed for EDF saying things are fine or things are going to be fine and then to be disappointed. But even if we have this, what will be the impact on electricity prices? I think in some sense here, I agree with Veronica. I think that we should not expect a huge impact on electricity prices, because the marginal, as long as the market works with prices being set by the marginal cost is obviously not nuclear, it's gas. So the electricity price problem is a gas price problem. So as long as we don't solve the gas price problem, I think, or else we change completely the way electricity prices are set. There have been some debates on how to use information on the spread of the electricity price between Germany and France, which is around 15%. And it's 15% lower in Germany than in France. In some sense, that would be one way to think about what would be the impact of having zero problem anymore on nuclear. So we can expect maybe a 15% decrease in prices of electricity, but not much more from nuclear. However, there will be huge profits at EDF if all of a sudden the nuclear plants work well. We're going to make huge profits, and I can tell you the French government is not going to sit still. We're going to raise these profits. So what are we going to do with the money? I don't know yet, but maybe we will indeed use the money to cap electricity prices one way or another. But all I'm saying is that nuclear, of course, if French nuclear works again, that will be very good. Not so much for the rest of Europe, as long as the electricity market works the same way. But maybe the French will take the money and do another price cap on electricity prices, which won't help that much the rest of Europe. And just a last word on I'm finished on price caps but at the European level, because of course it's a very different debate. With Beatrice Weber-Di Mauro, and here I would depart, I guess, from George. We had been in favor of a price cap on gas, but at the European level on the gas market, and that means also on Norwegian gas, because I don't think that the idea of the Commission, which is discussed today, which is a price cap only on Russian gas, is a very good idea for reasons we can discuss. But I do think that yes, we've never done sanctions on prices. We've always done sanctions on quantities. So we don't have experience of this type of sanctions. The same thing also for oil on the American idea on price cap on oil. We've never tried. There's a good chance that it doesn't work, but at this stage, I think it's worth trying.
Okay, so Philippe, thanks a lot. So we have now a very rich material on the table, and what I would like to do is I would like to ask all the three panelists one clarifying questions, and then I will kick off the Q&A. Let me start with Georg. Georg, so it was quite clear from my point of view what you said about the oil and taxing the imports on oil. the gas issue is a little bit more important in two dimensions, and there is also a question in the chat. First of all, it is not completely clear to me what you are saying about how Europe should respond to the current gas embargo first. So my understanding is you say Europe should form a kind of a gas cartel on the gas market in order to use the market power. But then at the same time, I'm not clear what you are saying about the credibility issue. So do you say that it is not credible that in the end we can get rid of the the Russian gas imports? Or are you saying we shouldn't do this? And we should also think about have a kind of a gas import tax, and also to bring us in a position also to lift the sanctions, for example, when Russia will make some concession during the negotiations. So this was also some kind of questions in the chat. So here I would like to hear a little bit more about this credibility issue. I was not sure if you have used this in a normative way or in a descriptive way, and I am not totally clear what is your proposal to deal with the Russian gas embargo in the short term and in the midterm, if you can clarify this a little bit.
Thanks a lot. I think I was not entirely clear in my presentation because I'm not kind of having the answer yet. I would rather put up the question. Now, as I see it, what we currently have in place in terms of natural gas is that the European Commission or also European leaders agreed to essentially phase down imports of Russian gas by 2027, if I'm not mistaken, without any further specification. So there is no sanctions in place on Russian gas. There is no no distribution of who gets how much. So it's only a kind of a phase out agreed. And I think this is not a credible policy stance that we are having here. And I think it's a rather risky one, especially as we currently are running around the world trying to sign LNG contracts with other suppliers, trying to see which shares of the value chain we have to outsource out of Europe to the US or other parts of the world, and always kind of the risk that at some point Russian gas comes back into the market with low prices and undermining the business model of some of those investments. And also kind of we have no tool currently to control Russian imports in a sense. So if Russia would now decide to tomorrow deliver to Uniper 50 BCM per year, then probably Uniper would be happy to take it, and we have no tool to prevent that from happening. And that's somewhat crazy in my view. Yeah. So what we would need is a sort of framework, and okay, we can say, okay, we want a complete embargo, but I mean, I think we are past that discussion now, and the Russians are essentially putting an embargo on us. So what we at least need to develop now is a certain tool, and I think the old French proposals about joint procurement here in this sense of Russia make so much sense that we definitely need to go for something like that. And we should not only specify then in this thing that there's only one place in Europe to which there's one counterpart, but there's also this counterpart decides on where this gas is being delivered, not that they kind of use it to congest or kind of put benefits to individual countries, when, how much, at what price. I know that it's politicization of gas. We always did not want that, but I think it's quite clear that we need that now, and we need this institution relatively quickly and stably, because the crisis will be over at some point, and the temptation to get this 50 BCM for a little price for a specific company will be very high, and so let's do it now.
Okay, thanks, Georg. Veronika, one question to you, and here I would also like to ask you for a short clarification. And Philippe also asked this question. So you are now advocating the extension of the lifetime for nuclear power plants in Germany, and your main argument is not so much to substitute gas, but at least I understand your argument that you want to use the nuclear power plants as a kind of an insurance against price spikes. So so this is my first question. So what is your assessment? How much would you expect? Because here I would say my guess is probably not too much, because the nuclear power plant is not the price setting technology. And the second aspect I would like to ask you, because you mentioned due to the high gas prices, so there's a huge risk that we have more coal-fired plants, in particular in Germany, but also in other European countries. And here, of course, the ETS1, the current ETS, comes in place with the CO2 price. And here I would like to ask you, so what is your recommendation? Because we see a lot of pressure at the European level, also not to intervene in the emission market. So if you could comment on these two issues, price spike in nuclear power and CO2 prices in ETS1.
Yeah, thank you very much for the possibility to clarify a little bit. I think there are several reasons why we should extend the nuclear power plants. One is that indeed it will relieve a little bit the price pressure, not very much probably, but it is not always the gas power plants that set the price, but it is also the inframarginal plants. If electricity demand is low, it's sometimes even the renewables. And the more we move the merit order outwards, the more often demand intersects with the merit order, with supply, at a low cost technology. And of course, this will not be done only by nuclear power plants, but by mobilizing now every capacity that is available on short notice. And this is nuclear power plants and coal power plants. And I think the argument that the gas prices always set the price, this is just not right. They often set the price because we have a lot of scarcity of supply in the electricity market, and this concerns also France. Also, France is depending on the gas-fired power plants if they determine the price in the European electricity market, because there is not enough supply of other sources. So that is one reason. The second reason is in the medium term. So we will have to extend and heavily use coal-fired power plants. And this will generate a lot of CO2 emissions. And you can assess a little bit how what is the impact on the emission price on the CO2 price in the emission trading system. And it is definitely far beyond the €5 that we just suspended as an increase in the national emission trading in Germany was in the context of the relief package. So the question is, is it worth to reduce the possibility to that the CO2 price is increasing by, say, 40, 50, 60 euro, because there's a lot of emissions coming in the upcoming years if we heavily use our coal-fired power plants. And the third reason would be the bargaining power of the German government if it comes to defending all the institutions in the electricity market and defending if they want to defend the emission trading system. If we shut off our nuclear power plants and emit a lot of CO2 and then come and say, but please don't touch the emission trading system, that's not very credible. So I think also in order to have some good bargaining position when it comes to talk about European institutions in the context of climate protection, I think it's very important to have a good position and not to damage the position from the onset. And I think the foreign countries look at us a little bit and are a little bit puzzled what is happening here. So this is basically the three reasons. We are just about to assess it for the medium term. And for the medium term, I mean, for the short term, there's not so much impact. But for the medium term, you see that there is quite some impact, but I have no reliable numbers yet, but you see that there is quite some impact. two quick issues. Targeted transfers. Philippe, I'm very much with you, but I think it's not a 0-1 issue. So there are also untargeted transfers that are undesirable. And I think also if you cannot do targeted transfer, I think we are in a much worse shape in Germany than you in France, because we cannot target low-income people very well. So, and this means that we have to improvise, but I think you can also do it very badly by these gasoline rebates and value-added tax rebates and so on, and you can do it a little bit more clever. One last issue, elasticities. I agree very much. We have not good data, but at the moment, what you hear from German industry, they reduce their gas consumption a lot, and they have a lot of possibilities to do so. Even at these high prices, a lot of things are happening which we would never have dreamed of if you just get in context and so on. I think the elasticities also in the short run have been very much underestimated at the beginning of the crisis.
Okay, thanks, Veronica. Philippe, you made a very, very interesting point. You said price caps, you acknowledge fully the inefficiency and so on, the usual microeconomic arguments, but at the same time you said there are macroeconomic gains. And it seems to me that there's an interesting trade-off here. On the one hand, we see a lot of price interventions, which in the end have a huge potential to increase the energy consumption in Europe. And if you look at the data, there is a lot of very perverse incentive in the current situation. But on the other hand, there is a macroeconomic gain. And that's a quite interesting aspect here. And probably you might clarify this point. And also Veronica raised this issue again, because it seems to me that's an interesting debate between microeconomists and macroeconomists. And there are two issues here. On the one hand, we have allocative efficiency and also equity issues, which are quite important. But at the same time, we have macroeconomic issues in a way which you have highlighted do not fit very well in the usual thinking about inflation, be it on the labor market and so on. Probably you might elaborate a little bit on this.
Yeah, thanks. Just a word on with Veronica. I think we agree. I mean, corner solutions where there's zero pass-through and zero price signal to households is a very bad idea. And I do think that in France we've went too far in that direction, and that we should go towards more pass-through of prices to consumers and more targeted transfers, even if they are difficult. But I think you will agree also, I don't know, maybe, that full pass-through of wholesale prices to households, I know that part of the price of households is not the wholesale price, but would be extremely difficult. And I'm not sure we should expect a big decrease in consumption of households, even if we had this huge increase in prices. Okay, so I think, but I don't know exactly where we can, and maybe we wouldn't disagree on where we are in the percentage of pass-through, but I agree that we don't like. I mean, the corner solutions are certainly not optimal. Or feasible. On your question, Otmar, so I'm not sure, I mean, thanks for saying it's interesting, but I'm not sure I can go much further. So I reach the limit of this intellectual debate, because yes, there are microeconomic losses in this type of policies, all these triangles. I don't know how large they are, and it depends very much on the empirical estimates of this elasticity, both on the supply side and the demand side. So here I would wait from my micro friends to give me some empirical estimates that I think we are missing. On the macro gains, frankly, this is not the way we think about the use of fiscal policy on inflation. So it's a bit heterodox, and I'm not sure we have a quantitative measure of these macroeconomic gains. There are some models that have tried to look at, price caps in Argentina, and where they basically were finding that, in the short term, it's good because indeed there's less inflation, but in the middle long term, then the microeconomic inefficiencies come back with a revenge. And so we have to be super careful. And so in the medium and long term, I'm all with the microeconomist. From that point of view, we have to be careful. We are also in a strange situation, at least at the beginning. Remember, at the beginning of this crisis, so fiscal policy was used to combat inflation with price caps, rebates, etc. And monetary policy was doing what? Was holding things, so that in particular the objective was to not to have a big increase in spreads across Eurozone countries, because the spreads would have made it difficult for some governments to finance themselves on debt market. So we had a complete inversion of the objectives of monetary policy and fiscal policy. Normally, we think of monetary policy as combating inflation and fiscal policy in charge of debt and fiscal issues. Here we were this completely strange situation where monetary policy, I'm exaggerating a bit, where monetary policy was in charge of making the financing of governments easier, and fiscal policy was in charge of combating inflation with fiscal measures. That's just can't work that way. Yeah. But anyway, that may be also an interesting remark.
Yeah.
Again, I'm reaching the limit of it, because in some sense, as long as we can't have a quantitative exercise on this, I'm not sure. But I still think it's important to have these macroeconomic impacts of these debates in mind, especially in the situation we are right now.
Yeah, I think that's very important. So in the end, it boils down a little bit to the question how large the Marshallian triangles are. And this reminds me to a very old bad joke where people said in Oxford, workers unite, you have nothing to lose than a few Marshallian triangles. And in the current gas crisis, you could say consumer unite, you have nothing to lose than a few Marshallian triangles. So it's a bad joke in the current situation, but I was tempted to make it. Now, there's a question here in the chat, a very important one, because we promised we will say something on climate policy in times of war. We talked a lot about energy security, but not too much on the climate issue. So I would like to bring in this dimension, and I would like to ask the panelists to respond to this, because if you look at the numbers, so the implication of the European Green Deal is that gas imports and oil imports in general, but also gas and oil imports from Russia would decline even before 2030, even without the Ukrainian war. So this is a very fundamental insight. And in the most recent paper, Georg made this argument again. So my question here is a little bit, so there's the proposal to form a gas and oil cartel. And in the end, this would lead to a reduction of oil and gas imports from Russia. But what we need is to make the Green Deal great again, is a decline and a reduction of the total amount of oil and gas imports. And at the European level, so there was an idea to implement a second ETS for the transport and building, which was roughly an upstream system for oil and gas. Now, the second ETS is a little bit sick in the hospital, so to say. And I would like to ask Georg and to comment a little bit. So on the one hand, how could we combine and bring together the energy security issue and the climate policy a little bit closer? And is then forming a gas and oil cartel, which reduces the oil and gas imports, the new substitute for the sick ETS too? So you might, Georg and Veronica, but also Philippe, you might comment on this.
If I may, I would zoom out a bit more kind of on this kind of crisis versus climate question. And I think we don't have the answer. The answer will be the politics that we are, or policy that we are going to see in the crisis. What I observe is we see a lot of lock-in in fossil investment at the moment. And it seems that this kind of, because they are having comparatively lower fixed cost, At the beginning, we might still see that that we are continuing or risking to essentially lock in and delaying decarbonization. At least that seems to be government policy in several member states, even though it's not clearly expressed as such. So I'm relatively worried, because money is getting scarce. We have to rearm, and we have the high energy prices. So there seems to be some movement to really kind of postpone the Green Deal in realpolitik, even though the statements all still look nice. The other point is that I find extremely important, and this was also part of the reason why we wrote this paper, is I'm quite worried about institutions, because a lot of these things that we have been discussing on price caps and so on a national level, I'm quite worried that some of these things we have been building over the past 30 years, like European electricity markets or emission trading systems, might get under the bus in the current crisis. And I think it's not impossible to think of that. Somebody in the chat asked for why do we not renationalize the entire sector, and I think if the crisis goes on, there is a substantial risk that some countries will go in that direction. And if we kill the single market for carbon permits, but also for electricity, it's not going to be possible to have a sensible decarbonization in the European Union anymore, because then everybody would just build whatever they can in terms of gas and coal, and just look on what is closest. And then a last, even a bit more remote area is the question of carbon of industry. I mean, we might potentially see quite substantial decarbonization in Europe by industry leaving the European Union, especially energy intensive and carbon intensive industry. Is that a good or a bad thing? Well, our policy stance is still we try to stem against that with carbon border adjustment mechanisms and subsidizing them, giving free allowances and so on. I'm increasingly wondering whether we are doing the right thing here. I mean, whether we should not let part of that go, because it's not only that they are carbon intensive, they are also very energy intensive. And Europe has become significantly energy poorer in the past years. So maybe we would need a significant readjustment of our way in which we deal with carbon intensive industry in Europe, that finds ways of decarbonizing those outside of the European Union, even so we initially preferred to do that domestically. So maybe 3 or 4 elements that not completely answer your question, but give you some of my thinking.
Thanks, Georg. So now we have 2 minutes left. I have to close at 7 sharp. So I promised this to the organizers. So 2 minutes, and you can share, Veronica, your 2 minutes with Philippe, or Philippe can trade you the 1 minute. So please go ahead.
I can try to make it very quick. I disagree. I mean, money is getting scarce, you said, but it's public money that is getting scarce. Private money is not scarce. There's a lot of money all over the world that could be mobilized to be invested in the energy transformation. I think the problem is a combination. Public money is getting scarce, and institutions that foster climate protection are at stake. And this combination, I think, is a big threat to climate protection, because this has the consequence that also private money is not mobilized. And I think this would be the clue to mobilize private investment in order to for the transformation, and not only in Europe, but to invest in Europe and in projects worldwide. And I think this is what we should aim at, to establish the institutions such that private money is mobilized in this situation. And this is a very hard issue at the moment, because the direction is more to damage institutions that would do it.
Okay, Philippe, now, if you like, you have the very last word now.
It's not a word, it's actually a question for all of you, all the panelists, but also those who are listening to us. If you have some estimates of what are these elasticities, super important elasticities for households on gas consumption, I mean, we should all, this is an appeal from a macro to microeconomists, we should all work on this right now, because this is a huge question. So don't hesitate, send me emails. if you are working on that. Actually, at the French Council, there's some work being done in the present circumstances. But if you have some ideas, some numbers, I'll take them and I'll cite them, of course, enormously. So thanks.
Thank you. I would like to thank all the participants and all the panelists. I apologize that we haven't been able to answer all the questions in the Q&A. So this was an extremely rich debate, an extremely rich material, a lot of things which have to be discussed further and thought through. So the elasticity is an important aspect, the Marshallian triangles, the macroeconomic implications, the future of climate policy in Europe. So this is quite interesting, and I would say we are now living in very, very challenging times. And even if we as economists have not all the questions at hand, at least it is a lot which policymakers ask us to come up with reasonable proposals. And I think we should do this in a quite modest way, but we should not be shy to participate in the public debate. I like to thank all of you, and I hope we can continue this debate very near in the future. Thanks a lot, and have a nice evening.